Early fall momentum slows as Fraser Valley sales dip in November. Jordan here with your Fraser Valley market update for December of 2025. Easing prices and abundant inventory weren't enough to entice buyers to the Fraser Valley market in November, as sales declined in line with seasonal buying patterns. Job numbers show some growth, but looking under the hood shows a less rosy picture than what they'd like you to believe. And it all falls under the shadow of the Cowichan case, which has recently turned into a much larger issue. Here's a brief video by Carolyn Elliott, political commentator and writer for thehub.com, to bring you up to speed.
Another massive court ruling in BC, and this one could lead to an overhaul of much of our legal system. The BC Court of Appeal has drastically expanded the role of the courts to allow them to strike down BC laws for inconsistency with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, known as UNDRIP. Now, much of UNDRIP is inconsistent with many of BC's laws, and it's behind some of the most problematic policies in BC, like the secretive land agreements that threaten our democracy and our prosperity. This ruling means that the court has now given itself the ability to determine whether provincial laws align with UNDRIP, and where that isn't the case, the court will now get to decide what action is required. This undermines our elected government's ability to act in the public interest and could lead to some serious upheaval. For those working in the natural resource sector, this means more uncertainty, less investment, and more job losses. For all of us, that potential lost investment means lower revenues to fund the programs and services we rely on. It's another layer on top of an already unworkable situation in BC. Our government should never have adopted UNDRIP in the first place because it's fundamentally inconsistent with our existing laws and with our government's ability and duty to act in the public interest. The message I have for David Eby is clear. Repeal your UNDRIP legislation or resign.
So we'll briefly cover both those two elephants, but first, let's dig into the local data. The Fraser Valley Real Estate Board recorded only 943 sales on its multiple listing service in November. That's a 16% decrease from October and 17% below the sales from this same time last year. New listings slowed again in November, down 26% month over month and 7% year over year to only 2,210. Overall inventory remains well above seasonal norms for the Fraser Valley, with 9,201 active listings, down 9% from October, but 47% above the 10-year seasonal average. It's normal for the market to begin slowing down this time of year, but we're seeing that natural market movement compound with the general market slowdown. I expect sales and new listings to continue slowing for the next couple of months at least, as most hunker down for the winter. The Fraser Valley remains firmly in a buyer's market, with an overall sales to active listing ratio of 10% in November, down 1% from October. A balanced market is typically defined by the board as between 12% and 20%. The composite benchmark price for a typical home in the Fraser Valley decreased 0.7% in November to $912,400. If we look at MLS HPI benchmark price by property type, we see that single-family detached fell to $1,405,500, down 0.6% compared to October and down 5.4% compared to November of last year. They took 52 days to sell on average, a significant increase from the previous month's average of only 42 days. Townhomes fell to $778,700, down 0.8% compared to October and down 6.8% compared to November of last year. They took 37 days to sell on average, no change from October. And lastly, apartments fell to $496,500, down 1% from October and down 6.9% compared to November of last year. They actually sped up slightly, taking an average of 41 days to sell, slightly faster than last month's average of 42 days. Maybe there's a pulse. As always, median days to sell gives a slightly different and, in my opinion, clearer picture. Detached slowed to 37 median days to sell, up from 30 the previous month. Condos were slightly slower than the previous month at 28 days, up from 26. And lastly, townhomes remain unchanged, which makes sense as they've continued to be the strongest property type. It's more evidence that buyers are pinched and just can't make the jump to detached, so they're buying the closest available option. It also shows that the desirable properties are still moving much faster than average, and I don't believe that'll ever change. Above, I mentioned that most markets remain in buyers' favor. However, the stats may skew slightly in the coming months as fewer sellers choose to list, assuming that they won't have success. Fewer listings paired with fairly steady sales will improve the sell-through rates and give the illusion that the market is improving. However, As soon as those sellers see a bit of that improvement and market movement, they'll rush back in and the ratios will drop off again. So bear that in mind. Speaking of illusions, CREA, or the Canadian Real Estate Association, recently adjusted the method they use to calculate the HPI, or Home Price Index. This has led to the majority of areas I track seeing significant jumps in HPI valuations, flattening the curve we've seen in the last 12 months. I'll give you an example. In October of 2025, CREA recorded the HPI on Abbotsford detached homes in September to be 1,152,500. This number was just revised to 1,222,400. That's a pretty massive increase and was applied across all markets and property types and leads to significantly skewed stats. I'm not saying it's a grand conspiracy to prop up the market and make it appear stronger than it actually is. But what I do believe is this is further proof that local market knowledge is the most important factor in building your buying and selling strategies. What I mean by this is anyone can throw stats around and they can be made to suit whichever narrative you need. But the reality of comparable sales will always trump that narrative. What your neighbor sells for locally will weigh much heavier than statistics that can be adjusted on a whim, and having that strong market knowledge makes a huge difference when negotiating. In other news, the federal government recently released job numbers, and on the face of it, they sound positive. 53,000 jobs added, unemployment drops to 6.5%. But what they failed to mention is that we lost 9,400 full-time jobs, and they were replaced with 63,000 part-time jobs, 16,000 of which were in the public sector. We also saw retail lose about 34,000 positions, and yet most of the new jobs, which were in healthcare and social services, not generally attributed to the youth employment, led to youth unemployment dropping 1.3% from 14.1% to 12.8%. Still way too high, but the numbers just don't line up. Unfortunately, the market saw the headlines and priced in the improvements, leading to bond yields jumping significantly over the last week, currently sitting at just under 3%, meaning homeowners praying for some fixed rate relief, they're out of luck for now, and will likely see rates rise as a result. In line with that positive growth, the Bank of Canada just announced they'll be holding the overnight lending rate at 2.25%. So variable rate holders, you're out of luck as well. Lastly, let's briefly cover the growing elephant in the room, the cow chase. I say briefly because I don't really want to get too deep into this beyond bringing it to your attention. At a really high level, the EB-NDP government used both the cover of emergency lockdowns in 2021 and the majority position to unilaterally sign the province up to UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's worth noting that the BC Conservatives, formerly the BC Liberals, participated in this. Basically, UNDRIP has now been elevated from an aspirational guideline into something approaching binding law, and courts are beginning to treat it that way. The Cowichan ruling is the first real test case, and the implications are massive because it signals a shift in how land rights, jurisdiction, and even private ownership may be interpreted going forwards. And Cowichan is only the first domino. There are more cases in motion that the government hasn't and refuses to disclose. Lenders are already backing out of deals because they don't know where that liability stops. There's one band trying to claim the entirety of Kamloops, and we're even seeing US-based bands asserting claims on Canadian land. It's also spreading across the country now. BC is the only jurisdiction that adopted UNDRIP in this way, and it was completely unnecessary. Yet every law here must now be reinterpreted through that lens. That means everything from land use to resource rights to long-settled property assumptions is suddenly up for grabs. It turns out if you elect activists, you get activism. The last point I'll make on the topic is simply this. There has been an untold amount of money spent on these issues. I've seen reports claiming hundreds of billions spent in recent years, as much as $1 trillion since 1975, the vast majority of which doesn't leave Ottawa or provincial government circles, paid to various lobbyists, NGOs, lawyers, band leaders, and a myriad of other professionals with their hands out, leading to very little money making it to the people it's supposed to be spent on. We've all heard about the lack of clean drinking water and reserves, despite billions of dollars spent. It truly belies belief. The Cowichan case alone had 78 lawyers attached to it. What we seem to have, rather than a reconciliation process, is a reconciliation industry, and no one can seem to answer what exactly it looks like to be reconciled. So call your MP and MLA. Seriously. With luck, Common sense prevails, and the 98% of the Canadian population that has nothing to do with reconciliation and bears no responsibility for the claims made therein are protected by the representatives they elected. Or at the very least, new ones are elected that will stand up for their and property rights in general. In the meantime, expect prices to continue sliding as sales slow. We may see a short-term bump in sell-through as listings dry up, but I don't think it lasts. If you're buying, you'll be working with fewer options, and you may find yourself negotiating against sellers who still think last spring prices apply. If you're selling, getting your price right from day one is the single biggest advantage you can give yourself. Beat the stale inventory, and you're first in, first out. And whatever side you're on, take every headline and every stat with a grain of salt, especially when the people putting them out can just adjust them whenever needed. But that's just my read on it, and I'm curious to know what you think. Do the job numbers look legit to you, or does it feel like another smokescreen before Parliament heads off for the winter break? And with everything happening from Cowichan to the shifting lending landscape, do you think confidence returns in the new year, or are we in for a longer stall? As always, if you have any questions about Fraser Valley real estate, whether that's buying, selling, or just wanting clarity on where the market's headed, I'm here to help. Thanks.